The night she wore his hat was the night everything between them shifted. The hat's on a peg by the door, and it's been there long enough that the felt's gone soft as a glove where my thumb used to ride the brim. Gray once. Sweat made a dark line around the band that no rain ever washed back out. There's a notch burned in the front edge where an ember from a branding fire spit up and ate a half-moon out of it, and I never trimmed it even, just let it scar. A man keeps a hat too long and it stops being a hat. It's a record of where his head's been. I'm telling you about that hat because of one night it wasn't on my head. It was on hers. And I have thought, more than a man ought, that everything I have got that's worth having came down off that high pasture in the dark on the strength of one night, and I had nothing to do with the choosing of it. She did the choosing. I just held still and let it happen to me, which is the only smart thing I did in about 40 years. Let me back up, I don't tell things straight. Never could, my head jumps. I came to the Maddox place in the fall, and I want to say it was a certain year, but the years run together for me now, and it doesn't matter. I'd been mustanging down on the breaks, me and 2 other men, and the 2 other men had drifted, the way men do, and I was getting too stove up to chase wild horses across hardpan for a living. My left ear had quit on me years back. That was the war, a gun that went off too near me, and after that the world came in on that side like it was wrapped in a wet blanket. I learned to keep my good ear to people, keep my good ear to the world. You'd be surprised how much of a man's life turns on which way his head is cocked. I rode up Lodgepole Creek looking for winter work and found an old man named Tobe Maddox standing in a corral with a colt that wanted to kill him. He was past the age for it. I could see that across the yard. He had a rope on the colt, and the colt had Tobe figured for the weaker animal, which he was, and the thing was going to drag him through the rails directly. I didn't say anything. I got down, walked in slow, and took up the slack on the rope from the side so the colt couldn't read me, and I talked low into him on the good ear side until the fight went out of his neck. Took maybe 10 minutes. When it was done, the old man looked at me a long while and spat and said, "You looking for work or just showing off?" I said both, I supposed. He hired me on for the winter at wages that wouldn't have fed a dog in town, and a bunk in the tack room with a stove that smoked, and that was the whole of it. No handshake even. Tobe Maddox didn't shake on things. He watched you instead for about 2 years, and if you were still there at the end of the watching, then you were hired. He had a daughter. I'm going to get to her wrong no matter how I do it, so I'll just say it plain. Her name was Nell. She'd married a man and gone off east with him, Ohio, I think, and the man had died fever, I heard later, though Tobe never once spoke of it, and neither did she, and she'd come back to the only place that was hers. She came back the spring before I came that fall. So when I rode up the creek, she was already there in the house, running the kitchen and the books and a good half of the work besides, and I want you to understand I did not look twice at her. Not because there was nothing to look at. Because a hired man who looks twice at the owner's daughter is a hired man looking for the road, and I'd been on the road enough. She wasn't soft. That's the first thing I learned about her, and it's the truest. She had her father's hands, square, scarred, a thumbnail gone black from a hammer that she never said a word about. She could throw a diamond hitch faster than I could and tie off a bleeder on a cut horse without her color changing, and the one time I tried to take a heavy thing out of her arms because I'd been raised to, she looked at me like I'd insulted her grandmother and carried it herself the whole way to the barn. I never did that again. So that's the 3 of us, old man, his daughter, and the deaf wrangler in the tack room. Now, the horses, because it all comes down to the horses in the end, and you can't understand the night unless you understand what we stood to lose. Maddox bred horses, not range stock, he bred a line. Had a stud, a big bay called Drummer, with a neck on him like the prow of a boat, and Tobe had built that line up over 30 years out of nothing, the way a man builds anything good, one careful mistake at a time. Cavalry remounts mostly, and good saddle stock for men who knew the difference. People came up that creek from 3 territories to put a mare to Drummer or to buy a 2-year-old off the hill. That was the money. That was the whole of the money. The land was poor and high, and the winters tried to kill you, but those horses were worth more than the ground they walked on, and everybody in the country knew it. Including Harlan Voss. Voss had the big outfit down the valley, the flat good grass, banker money behind him from somewhere, and he wanted the Maddox water and the Maddox grass, and I came to understand, the Maddox horses, and he was a patient man about it. The patient ones are the worst. A greedy fool you can see coming. Voss just waited. He'd ride up now and again on a fine horse with silver on the bridle and sit his saddle in the yard and be pleasant, and the whole time his eyes would be doing sums on the place. He was a widower himself and not old, and it didn't take me a season to see what the other sum was he was running. He looked at Nell the way he looked at the grass. Something he'd have in time when the holding of it got too hard for the folks who had it. Tobe died in his sleep the second winter I was there. I won't make a thing of it. He went the way a man like that ought, which is to say with his boots off for once and nobody watching, and Nell found him in the morning and came out to the barn where I was forking hay and stood in the door and said, "He's gone," in a voice that had already done its crying somewhere I didn't see. And I set the fork down and we buried him on the rise above the creek where he could keep an eye on the hill, because that's where she said he'd want to be, and she was right. After that it was the two of us and a debt. I didn't know how bad the debt was. She didn't tell me and I didn't ask because a hired man doesn't ask. But I'm not a stupid man, only a slow-talking one, and I could read the way she sat at the kitchen window at night with the lamp turned low to save coal oil, and the way the buyers thinned out that spring because word gets around when an old man dies that maybe the place is ready to come apart, and the way Voss started coming up the creek more, not less. He came up one afternoon in the green of that spring, and I was at the round pen with a filly, and he sat his horse and watched me a while, and then he said, friendly as you please, "She ought to sell, Renner, you know that. A woman can't run this kind of outfit alone." I kept working the filly. I had my deaf ear to him on purpose, and I let him think I hadn't caught it, and after a minute he said it again, louder, the way men do, and I said, still not looking at him, "She's not running it alone." He laughed at that, not mean, worse than mean, like I'd said something a child says. "No," he said, "I suppose she's got you." And he turned his fine horse and rode down the creek, and I stood there in the dust with the lead rope burning a little in my hand, and I'll tell you what I felt, because the Bible of my pride won't let me lie about it. I felt like exactly what he'd said. The hired man. The thing that came with the place, like the smoking stove and the swayback gate. 50-some years old, half-deaf, no land, no name worth the saying, and a man with silver on his bridle had just measured me in one look and found me to be a fixture. I went and put the filly up, and I didn't go in for supper. Told her through the door I wasn't hungry. First lie I ever told her, and a poor one, because she'd seen Voss ride out, and she wasn't a fool either. I want to tell you about her hands one more time, because there's a thing that happened that I left out, and it sits in me yet. It was that same spring before the night. I'd torn my hand open on a strand of wire, deep, across the meat of the palm, the kind that lays you open white before it fills red, and I'd wrapped it in a rag and gone on working, because that's what you do. And at supper she saw the rag had gone through, and she made me put my hand on the table under the lamp, and she cleaned it out herself. Didn't ask. Just took my hand in both of hers and turned it to the light. And she had a way of touching a wound, firm, no flinching, but not rough, and she stitched it with a needle she'd run through the lamp flame. And the whole time she talked to me low and even about nothing, about a mare that was due and whether the creek would jump its banks, the way you'd talk to a horse to keep it from minding the thing you were doing to it. And I sat there with my hand in hers and my heart going like a drum, and I thought, you fool, you old fool. She's gentling you the way you gentle a colt. She doesn't even know she's doing it. When she was done, she patted the back of my hand twice, the way you'd pat any beast you were finished with, and said, "Keep it clean, Renner," and got up to clear the plates. I have that scar still, white line across the palm. I look at it sometimes when I'm thinking and don't know I'm doing it. All right, the night. It came in April, which up that high is still winter, wearing a green coat to fool you. We'd had a warm stretch, false spring, grass coming, and against my better judgment. No, against my judgment, there wasn't anything better about it. We'd run the brood mares and drummer, and that year's foals up onto the high pasture to take the new grass, because the bottoms were grazed to nothing, and the horses were poor from the winter, and that high grass was the difference. 3 mares were heavy, due any day. One, a little blood bay called Tansy that Nell favored, was past due, and we'd been watching her. The morning of it, I didn't like the sky. It had a color to it I'd seen before and didn't have a word for. The wind came around to the north about noon and lay down flat, which is worse than a wind blowing, and the birds got quiet, and old wound in my bad knee started up, and I went and found Nell in the barn and said, "We need to bring them down." She looked at the sky and then at me, and she didn't argue. That's a thing about her I'll praise to my grave. She had her own judgment, and she'd back it against any man's, but she knew the difference between a man saying a thing to be right and a man saying a thing because he knew it, and she could tell which was which, and she said, "Saddle up, then," and went for her coat. We were too late, I'll own that. By the time we'd got the 2 saddle horses ready and a third on a lead, for if a mare gave out, the first of it was already coming down the country at us, gray and solid like a wall somebody was pushing, and the temperature went off a cliff. I have seen it drop 40 degrees in the time it takes to tell it. The false spring just folded up and quit, and the real thing came back with teeth. We rode up into it. I'm not going to be able to give you that night the way it was. I've tried over the years to give it to 1 or 2 people, and I always come up short because words are a daytime thing and that was past words. I'll give you pieces, that's all I've got. The wind first. It came across that high pasture with nothing to break it for 40 miles, and it took the breath out of your mouth before you could use it. Then the snow in it, not falling snow, driving snow, going sideways, fine as ground glass, and it found every gap in your clothes and it stung where it landed, and then it didn't sting anymore, which is the part that kills you. Then the dark, coming early, the storm hauling the night up over itself like a man pulling a blanket over his head. The horses had bunched in the lee of a rock's spine, tails to the wind, the foals jammed in the middle. Drummer was out at the edge of them, that big neck low, taking the worst of it on his own hide to break it for the rest, and I remember thinking even then, in the middle of it, you good old man, you. Even a horse will stand the line for his own. We had to move them, stand still in that, and by morning they'd be drifted and froze, foals first. We had to get them down off the height into the timber on the lee slope where the trees would break the wind and they'd live. It was maybe a mile. In daylight, in fair weather, 10 minutes. That night it took us until the dark was old. Here's where the hat comes in, and I want to tell it right because it wasn't a thing of romance. There wasn't a soft bone in that whole night. It was work and it was fear, and the hat was a tool like everything else. Her hat went first. She had a flat-crowned thing she favored, and the wind took it off her head clean. I saw it go. A black shape gone sideways into the gray and just gone, and her hair came down and froze in about a minute. And the snow started packing against the side of her face on the wind side, building up white on her brow and her cheek. And a man's face will freeze fast when it's wet like that, and I knew it, and so did she. I rode up against her, close, knee to knee, our horses crowding, and I took my hat off and jammed it down on her head. Hard, mashed it down so the wind couldn't take it. She had her mouth open to say something, to argue probably, because her instinct was always to refuse a thing given, but the wind took whatever she meant to say and threw it away, and she looked at me through the snow with the hat down nearly to her eyes, my hat, too big for her, the burned notch in the front of it, and I leaned to her good ear, or to her ear anyhow, and I hollered, "I've got the other one," meaning my deaf ear took the wind, see. The cold side of my head was already half gone to feeling, and it didn't matter the way it'd matter on her. Some advantage to a ruined ear after all. The thing the war took from me, I gave it that night to her, is one way I've thought of it, though that's a fancier thought than I had at the time. At the time I just had the one bare hat, and the math was plain. She didn't argue, that's the thing, she quit refusing. She took the hat I gave her and bent her head down into the brim of it and turned her work side to the wind, and we went to it. And from then to dawn we were one thing, the two of us, doing the one thing. We got behind them and we pushed. You can't drive horses in a storm like you'd drive cattle. You go quiet and slow and steady, and you let them feel the pressure of you and trust that you know where the warm is, because they don't. They only know the wind, and they'd stand and die in it from not knowing where to go. We worked the edges. I took the wind side, the high side, and she took the down side to keep them turning toward the timber, and we leaned into them, hour on hour, a few yards at a time, losing ground when a mare broke and bolted, and one of us had to ride out into the white after her and turn her back, and I lost sight of Nell more than once out there, and had to ride on faith that she was where she ought to be, and she always was. Every time. I'd come back to the bunch, and there she'd be, the hat down over her eyes, hunched in the saddle, working them down the slope. Somewhere in the deep of it, Tansy started to foal. The worst possible thing. A mare down and laboring in the open in a killing storm, and the bunch wanting to scatter off her, and the cold that would take a wet newborn in minutes. Nell got to her first and was off her horse and down in the snow with the mare before I'd half understood what was happening. And I got the bunch turned and pressed them into the timber finally, the rock of the trees taking the wind off all at once, so that it was suddenly only loud instead of murderous, and I tied my horse and ran back out into the open for her. I'm going to leave most of that part out. It's a hard thing and you don't need it. I'll say that a foal came in the snow in the dark, with the two of us working over the mare with our hands gone past feeling. and that we got the wet thing up off the frozen ground and into a slicker and against the mare's flank and rubbed it, both of us, our 4 hands going, and that it took that ragged first breath, then a better one, and that the mare came up off the ground and stood over it, and that we drove the both of them, mare walking slow and the foal staggering at her side. The last 100 yards into the trees where the rest of them were, and the bunch closed around them and the foal lived. It lived, I want you to hear that. We did not lose one head that night, not a mare, not a foal, not the old stud. We brought every one of them off that mountain alive, the 2 of us, and it was the hardest thing I ever did, and the only thing I ever did that I am all the way proud of, with nothing held back, no part of me arguing. By the time the wind began to die, it was gray with morning, that low dirty gray, but daylight, and you could see again, and the snow had let off to a few last hard flakes. We stood in the timber among the horses, the both of us, and we were past the kind of cold a fire fixes. I couldn't feel my feet. My hands had stopped being hands. Her face on the wind side had gone white-gray and waxy at the cheekbone, frostbit, though it came back later and left only a little mark she carries yet. A pale patch the size of a thumbprint that I have kissed more times than I can count and won't talk further about. And she was standing there in my hat. That's the picture. That's the one I've kept. The storm gone quiet, the light coming, the horses around us breathing steam, the foal up against its dam, and Nell Maddox standing in the snow in a man's hat too big for her, the burned notch in the front of it, her hair froze and her face raw, looking at me. She came across the snow to me, slow on dead feet the way we were both walking, and she didn't say anything for a minute. She just stood close, in under the brim of my hat, looking up at me out from under it. Then she took my hands. Both of them in both of hers, the way she'd taken my one hand that night under the lamp, only this was no gentling. Her hands were as ruined and cold as mine, and she held them and looked at them, my old cracked, frozen hands, like she was reading them, and then she looked up at me and she said my name. Not Renner, my given name. Asa, she said, Asa. And I will tell you I had not heard that name spoken by a living soul, and I could not tell you how many years. It had near died for lack of use. And she said it like it was a thing she'd been keeping somewhere and decided that morning in the snow to spend. She said, Asa, Voss came up again Tuesday. He's offered to clear the whole debt, all of it, marry me and take the place and clear it. I felt the bottom go out of me. I thought, well, there it is. She's telling me she's going to do the smart thing, the only thing, and she's man enough to tell me to my face instead of letting me hear it from somebody at the rail. I respected it even while it was killing me. I started to nod. I started to say something about how that was sense, and how I'd see her stalk through the rest of the spring and then drift, the way men do. And she squeezed my hands hard enough to hurt, what feeling there was left in them, and she said, I told him no. I told him no Tuesday, and I'd have told you sooner, only I'm a coward about some things. I don't want his cleared debt. I don't want to be a thing a man buys with a banker's money to round out his grass. I've been bought once, by a man who was kind enough about it, and it near hollowed me out anyway. She had to stop, the cold or the rest of it, I don't know. Then she said, I've watched you 2 winters, Asa Renner, same as my daddy did. I know what you are. You'll take the wind side and never say a word about it. You gave me the only hat you had and rode the whole night with your bad side to the storm and never let on. That's the man I want at my back when the next one of these comes, because there'll be a next one, not the silver bridle. You. If you'll have a poor place and a sharp-tongued woman and a frostbit cheek, you'll have me. And I'll not ask you twice because my feet are froze and I want to go to the fire. I want to tell you, I said something fine back to her. I didn't. I'm not a man for the fine thing in the moment. What I did was I let go of her hands and I took her face, careful, on account of the frostbit cheek in my 2 ruined hands. And I looked at her under the brim of my own hat for a long minute. This woman, this hard good woman with her father's hands and her own iron will, who had stood in a killing storm all night and not broke and not run and then chose me. The deaf hired man over a cleared debt and a flat green valley freely with her eyes open, knowing exactly what she was getting and what she was passing up. And then I just put my forehead down against hers under the hat, and we stood like that in the snow with the horses around us, and I didn't say anything, and I didn't have to. She knew. She'd known before I did, like she'd known the storm was real when I said it was. We rode down the mountain in the full morning with the sun coming hard off the new snow so bright it hurt, leading the mares, the foal walking under its dam's neck. And she had my hat on the whole way down, and I rode bareheaded in the cold and didn't feel it. Voss came up one more time, weeks later, when the snow was off and the grass was good and Tansy's foal was running circles in the round pen on legs that had near died. Came up on his fine horse with the silver bridle. He sat in the yard and looked at the place a while, did his sums, and then he looked at me. I was on the porch. Nell was beside me, and I'll give him this, he was patient enough and smart enough to read a yard. He saw how she stood. He saw the band of a ring on her hand, an old plain one that had been her mother's, that she'd put back on for me. He saw whose porch it was now. He touched his hat to her, not to me, and he said, "Mrs. Maddox," and she said, "It's Mrs. Renner now, Harlan," easy as anything, and I watched him take that, and he was gentleman enough to nod, and he turned the fine horse and rode down the creek, and he never came up it again. We kept the line. Drummer threw foals another 4 years and his sons after him, and the buyers came back the way buyers do when they hear an outfit standing. And we paid the debt down ourselves, slow, the hard way, a careful mistake at a time, and there were more storms. She was right about that. There were always more storms, and we rode out into every one of them together, and I always took the high side, and she always let me. And that was its own kind of love between us that I never had words for, and don't need them now. She's still here, I should have said that. Out feeding this morning, slow now like me, her hair gone the color of that hat. 60-some years that thumbprint of frostbite has sat on her cheek, and I have kissed it most days of my life, and I'll kiss it again before the sun's down, the Lord willing. And the hat's on its peg by the door, gone soft, the notch still burned in the front of it. I never wore it much after that night, to tell you the truth. Bought another for working in. That one I kept for what it was. The night she wore it was the night I stopped being the thing that came with the place and started being the man who lived there. I didn't do it. She did it, with her two froze hands around my two froze hands in the snow, with my own name that I'd near forgot the sound of. All I did was give her the hat because I had the bad ear to spare, and the math was plain. Funny how the math comes out when you live long enough to see the end of the sum. There she is, coming in now. I can hear the gate. Good ears still good enough for that.